The 12-day war of 2025 was a moment of incredible danger for the whole world. Fought between the nations of Iran and Israel, the war was decades in the making, and when direct armed conflict finally broke out, the results were devastating. Dozens of civilians died in Israel, hundreds of civilians died in Iran, tens of thousands were displaced or injured, and the world narrowly avoided a much wider regional conflict in the Middle East. Iran's nuclear program was devastated and likely set back years at minimum. The nation's command and control apparatus was gutted. Missiles, drones, and debris rained down across Israel. But as horrific as the war between Iran and Israel was, as close to the brink as it brought the Middle East and the entire world to war, let's make one thing oh so very clear. The outcome could have been a lot worse. 4 months later, the leadership in Jerusalem and the leadership in Tehran seem to agree. Although the battles have paused for now, this war ain't over. Global experts are sounding the alarm. Both sides are rearming, and both of them see new opportunities and face new pressures that make a return to war more likely. And this time, there are no guarantees that the world will get lucky and avoid the all-out war, the total war that both Iran and Israel chose not to pursue. There's still time for diplomacy to prevail. There are ways to avoid a crisis of far greater magnitude. But if the world does nothing, then there's a growing risk that the Middle East could return to war sooner rather than later. Just a quick pause to share something with you that we are rather excited about over here. No, we're not asking for donations to fund our counter lawsuit against Somalia yet. Also, probably won't be necessary. Instead, we want to tell you how WarFronts has expanded into a brand new medium. Fronts.co. It's a website. It's not a .com because that was unavailable, and even if available, really expensive. This was expensive enough. So, after launching our newsletter earlier this year, we realized there is an appetite out there for our brand of analysis in the written form. So, we got in touch with some experts, including actual award-winning journalists who agreed to write for us. I know. They did, though. They did. WarFronts grew so fast. And now we're showing you the results. Fronts.co is our subscriber-only website featuring longer-form, in-depth articles on aspects of defense and geopolitics that we feel are getting overlooked. The inner mechanics of Russia's sanctions evasion, how maths can make you a better warfighter. Yes, really. And if you want serious analysis for dangerous times, this Fronts.co, that site, is the place to be. Beyond that, it's also going to be the home of exclusive videos. Twice a week, we'll be publishing bonus WarFronts episodes covering everything we do best, like assessing whether Poland or Russia would win were war to break out tomorrow. All of this is just $5 a month or $50 a year. That's fronts.co, not .com, and nothing on WarFronts is changing. All of the content you love remains here as ever. It's all just extra. And now back to today's video. So, as we explore the possibility of a renewed Iran-Israel conflict in the coming months, we're going to need to understand the core premise that we've already mentioned, that as ruinous as this year's conflict already was, it was still a very limited engagement compared to what both sides were capable of. During that prior conflict, both Iran and Israel, as well as the United States, were fighting to inflict damage and achieve a set of core objectives, but all parties involved still chose to limit their involvement in a successful attempt to make sure that the conflict could be drawn down and resolved relatively quickly. On Israel's side, the nation avoided killing Iran's supreme leader and other high-ranking clerics, chose to cripple one single element of Iran's missile production chain instead of continuing its strikes until Iran's missile capabilities were destroyed fully, and of course, it refrained from drawing on its nuclear arsenal. Iran avoided launching the scale of drone swarms that would have fully overwhelmed Israeli air defenses. It avoided forcing the hand of proxy allies like Hezbollah to draw them into the conflict, even involuntarily, and it avoided any action to try and close the Strait of Hormuz, thus holding hostage a large share of the world's oil. Both sides avoided targeting vulnerable civilian populations located far from military assets, and neither side gave even the slightest indication that they could involve their ground forces. The United States kept its involvement carefully limited, avoided pushing its European or Middle Eastern allies to play a significant role, and only engaged in a fraction of the offensive strikes that it was capable of. Yeah, Israel and the US wanted to target Iran's nuclear program, and yes, Iran wanted to inflict enough pain on Israel that it could deter future attacks, but all sides went into the conflict with the hope that they could leave themselves a suitable off-ramp to draw down hostilities. After 12 days of intense bloodletting, that's precisely what happened. Of course, the aftermath of that 12-day engagement could have gone a couple of ways. The international community could have stepped in and placed meaningful incentives on both Iran and Israel in order to draw them into a more comprehensive peace accord, giving both Tehran and Jerusalem real, tangible reasons to keep the peace and avoid even the chance of a further conflict. Of course, that's not what happens, and instead, the world has witnessed the other option. Both Israel and Iran went back to their respective corners, took a bit of time to lick their wounds, and then got back to business, operating on the premise that the adversary they'd only just gone to war with would probably go to war with them again in the future. Now, to understand the factors that make a return to war more likely, we've got to look at both Iran and Israel and understand what's happened between the end of their prior conflict and today. So we'll start with the nation of Israel, which emerged from the 12-day war with a far better argument to claim victory, but still has had to deal with some very important challenges in the aftermath. For one thing, Israel appears to have been only partially successful in accomplishing its wartime objectives. Despite the bombardment of key Iranian nuclear sites, neither Israel nor the United States nor the International Atomic Energy Agency has been able to conclusively determine the fate of Iran's roughly 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. Iran is believed to still have the requisite centrifuges and other equipment to continue enriching its uranium, and while Iran has sustained significant disruption to its ability to launch missiles and drones, it does still have some infrastructure available to do so. Just as important, Israel and its main ally, the United States, depleted many of their air defense interceptors over the course of the 12-day conflict. In fact, the United States is estimated to have depleted a full 1/4 of its high-quality missile interceptors during just those 12 days alone, and US officials indicate that despite Israel's denials, Jerusalem may be facing a similar problem. Then there are a range of other international circumstances that incentivize Israel to consider a return to war and disincentivize Israel from placing trust in the idea of peace. For one thing, Israel's recent decision to conduct airstrikes against Hamas in the nation of Qatar has set the wider Middle East on a knife's edge, with the rich and powerful leaders of the Arab world no longer willing to treat Israel with the relative openness that they've shown over the last decade. Israel's attempts to normalize relations with the Arab world are in jeopardy, and the Arab League recently joined forces with a number of European nations that recognize Palestinian statehood for the first time in a move that Israeli leaders have broadly interpreted as a sign of growing hostility. Israel is also more isolated in its war effort in Gaza and has even faced limited pressure from the United States. At the same time, a series of negotiations with Hamas are ongoing at the time of writing, but they do risk falling apart for several reasons. And the US has indicated to Israel that if Hamas refuses a deal, Israel may be empowered to take greater unilateral action in Gaza. Taken together, those international factors create a situation where Israel seems to feel isolated, forced to fend for itself, and less trustful of the international community's willingness to help resolve disputes in Israel's favor. At the same time, a growing chorus of global experts and observers agree that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political survival has been tied to the war in Gaza for some time, and that Netanyahu is incentivized to continue the war in Gaza or even expand conflict to other sectors as a way to remain in power. And Netanyahu is far from the only leader in this discussion who may see war as the best way to retain power. In Iran, the nation's clerical leaders are even more vulnerable than they've ever been, caught between a crumbling economy, an enduring popular opposition movement, and a crisis of faith among regime loyalists who now doubt the stories of military might that Tehran has been selling for decades. The nation's military leaders have been made paranoid by a wave of Israeli assassinations and are known to be working out contingency plans and orders of succession in case the current wave of leaders is wiped out in a renewed conflict. The regime is working to hunt down and arrest anybody who might even be suspected of being an Israeli asset, and has executed more people in 2025 than it has in any year since the 1979 revolution, including a man named Barman Kabiasel, who was hanged in late September and described as, quote, one of the most important spies for Israel in Iran. At the same time, Iran is reportedly working to reconsolidate and rebuild its air defenses as quickly as possible, prioritizing short-range drone interceptors that would have been helpful against many of the drone attacks Israeli assets are suspected of having launched in asymmetric attacks on Iranian soil. According to leaked Russian documents that were exposed by a Ukrainian hacking group, Iran has inked a deal for 48 copies of Russia's Su-35 fighter jet, including early deliveries as soon as 2026 if Russia can keep to the intended schedule. Iran is also looking to acquire Chinese J-10 fighter jets and may already have purchased MiG-29s from Russia, all in an attempt to address Israel's ability to gain air superiority so quickly during the last war. Meanwhile, Iran continues to test ballistic missiles, showing that it has at least some launch capability remaining, and it's thought to still be able to produce long-range, low-cost kamikaze drones. But while these factors, by themselves, might point to the idea that Iran would take time, lock down its regime stability, and spend a few years gathering and rebuilding weapon systems, Iran's international situation is creating pressure for Tehran to push up its timeline. In mid-October, Iran was hit by so-called snapback sanctions from the United Nations, which had been suspended as part of the global attempt to get Iran to peacefully call off its nuclear weapons program. Those renewed sanctions are expected to hit Iran very hard. And although Iran's subversive financial arrangements with nations like Russia and China can blunt the pain somewhat, the results will still make public fury toward the regime even more intense. Iran's ability to finance rearmament will start to decline, the unity of its ruling elites will begin to fray, and regime collapse becomes far more likely. Add to that the reports that Iranian officials believe that Israel is planning a new round of strikes, seemingly confirmed by recent statements by Benjamin Netanyahu, who insists that Israel knows where Iran's remaining nuclear stockpiles are held. And across the Middle East, growing destabilization and disunity make for an environment that practically fosters a future war. The nation of Syria is on the brink of a return to violence, most recently due to a standoff between Damascus and the autonomous Kurdish region of Riyadh, while the Islamic State continues to reconstitute itself in the border zones between Syria and Iraq. And speaking of Iraq, that nation is increasingly unstable, while, as we mentioned, Gulf states like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates are now on guard against the prospect of strikes from all directions, even from Israel. Hardliners within Iraq's longtime proxy ally Hezbollah are trying to resist a push for disarmament, and although they no longer have the ability to threaten Israel directly in the way they could have done before 2024, they can certainly destabilize Lebanon and threaten Israeli forces that are still stationed on Lebanese territory. An ongoing pattern of arms interceptions shows that Iran is still working to arm Hezbollah, Yemen's Houthi rebels, and proxy militias in Iraq and Syria, all the while the United States appears to be working to draw down its involvement in the Middle East, creating the first hint of a diplomatic and security vacuum that all sorts of bad actors could exploit. Alright, so with that whole situation in mind, let's lay out a few of the specific fault lines that would incentivize each side to consider a return to fighting instead of a commitment to peace, and that would specifically incentivize a quick return to violence instead of a years-long build-up. Israel has taken a hit to its air defenses, and Iran seems as if it wants to rebuild its long-range strike capability, meaning that if Israel waits, Iran might learn the lessons of its past engagement, rebuilding its arsenal and rethinking its tactics so that Israel is forced to burn interceptors faster and become more vulnerable. Israel and Iran seem to agree that Iran's enriched uranium was not destroyed, incentivizing Israel to try and target it while reliable intelligence is still coming in, and incentivizing Iran to consider forcefully deterring Israel so that Israel doesn't try to target that material again. Iran is facing greater regime instability than ever, but that problem is going to get worse as the months and years go on, not better, meaning that even though it's far from an ideal time for Iran to hit Israel, it might be now or never. And similarly, Israel's leaders are feeling their isolation on the global stage and may fear a collapse of their government if they can't use the threat of an external enemy to justify their continued hold on power. Then there are the international fault lines to consider. The wider Middle East is getting more fractious. The Arab world's perceptions of Israel are dropping quickly. Israel's non-US allies are frustrated with Jerusalem's conduct, and Iran's proxies abroad are still armed and dangerous, but getting desperate, all contributing to the idea within the Iranian regime that now is as good an opportunity as they're going to get. But that same combination of factors makes Israel more likely to engage, both because Jerusalem may see changing international perceptions as a sign of darker days ahead, and because Jerusalem may reason that if Europe, the Arab world, and other international forces have already been alienated, then Israel has nothing left to lose by taking the sorts of actions that it's avoided because Israel would have risked alienating them. And perhaps most dangerous of all, there's a chance that both Israel and Iran may come to the conclusion that they would have the advantage in acting quickly. Look at it from Israel's perspective, where the Iranian regime is on the brink of collapse and could be toppled with one big final push. If indeed Israel knows where Iran's nuclear materials are being stored, it could destroy that equipment before Iran has the chance to hide it or split it up. Israel knows that Iran will try to procure combat jets, rebuild its air defenses, and reconstitute its long-range missile and drone threat. But all of that hasn't happened yet. And if Israel strikes first and strikes hard, then perhaps it never will. But look at the same situation from Iran's perspective, and there are ways to get to the same conclusion. Israel is more isolated than ever, and Iran might believe it stands a better chance of using war with Israel or the threat of war to gain more favorable treatment than it could otherwise get. Iran knows that Israel is low on air defenses right now, but that if Israel is given time, that problem will be addressed. Iran knows that even though it's not in a good position to strike right now, it's in a better position than it will be once international sanctions really start to bite. And it knows that the same is true for its proxy forces in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. That in a couple of years, they could be disarmed, devastated by one-on-one wars with Israel, or lose an appetite for conflict. But right now, they can be drawn into a war on Iran's side. In a situation where both sides believe that they've got something to gain from instigating a violent exchange, and where they also believe their adversary has a lot to lose, both nations have ample incentives to ratchet up tensions. They have incentives to issue clear threats of violent escalation, and then to engage in military provocations, and then, when they're shown what's supposed to be a deterrent, they have an incentive to escalate again because they believe that they're willing to go farther than their adversary. But when both sides feel that way, the situation is at its most dangerous, because when both sides are climbing an escalation ladder and waiting for their enemy to back down, there's a real possibility that both sides might just keep on climbing before realizing, a little too late, that their enemy was more willing to engage in a conflict than they'd initially realized. Of course, as we said at the outset of today's episode, and we'll really stress this point again, a new round of escalation between Iran and Israel does not need to happen. It is far from guaranteed. There are still plenty of opportunities for diplomacy and level-headedness to prevail, and we really hope that that's what's going to happen. But we simply cannot ignore the threat of renewed violence in the Middle East. And while a small but growing group of experts and outlets are starting to sound the alarm, the risk appears to be significantly greater than most global headlines would suggest. It's worth taking a moment now to identify some of the conditions that could lead to either Israel or Iran pulling the trigger in the coming months. For Israel, the most likely prompt would be some sort of clear evidence that Iran has either restarted its full-scale nuclear enrichment efforts or has started to enrich its existing stockpiles to a level closer to weapons grade. There's also the possibility that the Netanyahu government could turn its attention toward Iran and begin to lay the groundwork for future conflicts in the event that it strikes a ceasefire or even a true peace deal with the Hamas organization. If, as suspected, the Netanyahu government feels it needs a war or national security crisis to ensure that it remains in power, then the end of the war against Hamas would create a vacuum that a war with Iran could easily fill. For Iran, one trigger could be an escalation of Israel's offensive in the Gaza Strip in the event that a peace accord fails to materialize, and instead Israel doubles down on its current efforts. Or, if the notoriously paranoid regime were to uncover large-scale infiltration by Israel's Mossad or identify some real or perceived plot against it, Iran could choose to react violently. Most troubling of all, however, is the possibility that either side could choose to return to conflict because of a combination of building stressors rather than any acute threat. The nice thing about an acute threat, to the extent that anything is nice about this situation, is that a return to fighting would probably be preceded by global news reports, diplomatic rhetoric, military posturing, and other clear indicators that something's about to go down. But if either Israel or Iran believes that as a result of their overall situation, it's in their interest to launch an attack, then that makes a surprise attack much more likely. Surprise assaults make all sides more uncertain, especially the nation on the receiving end, and it raises the odds that they might opt for their own disproportionate response, setting the stage for more escalation and then even more after that. Okay, so as we conclude today's episode, we've got to consider one final question. If Israel and Iran do return to conflict in the coming months, then what could that conflict look like? We'll say it a final time because we really want to be abundantly clear. There are still lots of ways to avoid a return to fighting, and the odds of a conflict aren't so high that it should be considered unavoidable. In fact, it's very avoidable, and hopefully Iran, Israel, and the international community will be able to ensure that a conflict doesn't happen. But in the event that it does, we shouldn't expect it to look the same as the 12-day war that took place earlier this year. Instead, we should expect that both nations have learned the lessons of that prior exchange and will be more ready to avoid their adversaries' strengths and zero in on their weaknesses. Let's consider the possibility of an Israeli attack first. Right now, Iran's air defenses are still very far from being rebuilt, and an Israeli attack would probably take full advantage of that vulnerability. With no meaningful air defense capability and no combat-ready aircraft to battle Israeli warplanes in the sky, Iran would be at Israel's mercy against a coordinated all-out air attack. This time around, Israel may lean more heavily on its non-stealthy F-15 and F-16s, carrying heavier payloads into Iranian skies, especially through the F-15, and raining down with as much ordnance as possible as quickly as possible. In that scenario, Israel would likely prioritize two types of Iranian targets. First, Israel would work to eliminate Iran's remaining ballistic missiles, especially its launch installations and mobile launch platforms, while wiping out as many of Iran's long-range drones as possible. That way, Israel can neuter Iran's ability to strike back, potentially even preempting an immediate counterattack if Israel's intelligence is good enough and its aircraft can hit their targets accurately enough. The second group of targets are economic: oil fields and refineries, natural gas infrastructure, drone and missile production factories, seaports, airports, large manufacturing centers. While Israel may also seek to target Iran's nuclear materials, we shouldn't necessarily expect those materials to be at the top of Israel's list. Instead, if Israel can both prevent Iran from launching a counterattack and devastate what remains of its economy, it makes the threat of regime change into a truly acute possibility. This combination of attacks may be enough to force Iran to the table, or even better for Israel, it could force a full collapse of the Ayatollah's regime. Of course, there are no guarantees that the Ayatollah would live to see the regime's collapse. In the event that Iran didn't capitulate, Israeli warplanes in the sky and intelligence operators on the ground would have ample time to hunt its nuclear materials down, especially as it continues to target drone and missile stores and maintain the early advantage that prevents a shortage of interceptors from becoming an acute concern. In Israel's ideal world, the United States would be playing a far more active role, deploying its fighter and strategic bomber aircraft and using its heaviest bombs to destroy deeply buried targets that Israel can't reach. Then there's the opposite scenario, where it's Iran on the attack and Israel on the defensive. In that situation, Iran would need to make the most of the ballistic missiles it still has and would likely attempt an initial attack using similar tactics to what Russia has done in Ukraine, launching a massive wave of incoming drones to soak up air defense interceptors and trying to time the launch of more dangerous missiles to punch through the gap. This is exactly what Iran chose to do in one of its 2024 exchanges with Israel, and while Iran's initial salvo during that assault stressed the limits of Israel's air defenses, it could easily launch many more kamikaze drones than it did during that 2024 attack. This time, Iran would probably employ cluster munitions, missiles loaded with small bomblets that can still rain down and cause damage even if a missile is successfully intercepted. At the same time, Iran would likely attempt to divide Israel's attention in multiple directions at once, perhaps by leveraging its proxy forces in, say, a Hezbollah ground assault against Israeli emplacements, a rocket and drone attack from Syria and Iraq, and an attack that could leverage drones and long-range cruise missiles from Yemen. Or if Iran's proxies refuse to engage, Iran could still divide Israel's attention by throwing them under the bus, creating the perception that an attack is imminent and thus forcing Israel to split off some of its defensive assets. In that situation, Iran may be able to exploit the Arab world's strain with Israel, knowing that those nations are less likely to intervene in Israel's defense. Iran may be able to soak up Israeli interceptors fast enough that, at least for a little while, its drones and missiles have a decent chance of scoring hits. And although Iran stands quite literally zero chance of defeating Israel in an extended air war, Iran would likely have a different series of plans in mind. It wouldn't take long at all for Iran to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, which it could then use as a bargaining chip to try and extract some sort of favorable concessions, long-term sanctions relief, some sort of compromise around its nuclear program, or anything that could help the Iranian regime to survive and recover a little bit of ground. And make no mistake, this would be a desperate play by Iran, chosen by a ruling regime that's in a desperate situation. But if it were a play that Iran was willing to make, then the regime would give itself more leverage by demonstrating that it could inflict real damage on Israel, possibly including more targeted attacks against economic, political, or religious assets, or even against civilians. Whether it's Israel or Iran that would choose in this dark hypothetical that it was time to pull the trigger, the result would undeniably bring pain and tragedy to the people of both nations. Miscalculations will only make the pain worse as one side or the other overestimates their capabilities, fails to perform as expected, and is drawn deeper into what would soon become a long war. Right now, Israel and Iran might both be open to the idea of a return to fighting, but that conflict would soon become a race to the bottom, a war of attrition that only one will survive and that neither will endure without pain. If the Middle East gets lucky, then none of this will happen, but waiting for a day when luck favors the Middle East is a typically losing proposition. Thank you for watching.